Hello and welcome to this episode of Akrinos Access. I'm your host, Eric Matei, joined today by Mike White and Tiffany Harrison of CLA for a deep dive into a concept that so many doctors want to ensure they have at the forefront of their business and strategy, and that is better understanding KPIs and financial benchmarks and how to utilize these to drive growth and profitability. Mike, Tiffany, welcome to Akrinos Access. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Yeah.
So I know we've got a lot of things that we kind of want to unpack in this episode, but to kick things off, why don't you all please share a little bit about your respective backgrounds?
Yeah, happy to. I have been in the healthcare industry for over 20 years, served as both a CFO and then on the audit side, and really helping physicians, practices look at those financial fundamentals and better understand those.
Yeah, and my name is Mike White. I'm based here in Dallas, actually along the roads with Tiffany as well. One of the national leaders on the healthcare side of the practice on insurance, outsourcing, accounting, advisory. These conversations, which is great. I love the KPI or key performance indicator discussion. I think it's so valuable and important. I actually was in a conference myself, Eric, the last couple of days, and they said we got to get away from KPIs and we got to talk measurables, right? What are the practice measurables? And I like that as well. So, let's jump into it. It'll be fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what makes this so fascinating is that in this concept of KPIs and financial benchmarking, it's where operations meets the financials.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's imperative that the doctors look at their business in that way to really get a full view of what's going on. So maybe to kick off the conversation, let's just start by defining these concepts. Define KPIs, define financial benchmarking, and then maybe let's discuss a little bit about the role of each for an eye care practice.
Yeah, perfect. Well, Eric, I can take that one.
So do you want to jump in on just the definition?
Yeah, that'd be great. So I think really when we think about KPIs, we're really looking at a way to measure performance against strategic objectives. So, and then when we think about benchmarking, it's really taking that performance and being able to compare against the industry standards, peers, or even, importantly, against your own historical results.
And I think all too often, I'm really glad that you pointed out that piece about comparing to yourself, because I think, and I'm sure we'll get into this in the conversation here, you look at some of these numbers in different markets and can have stark contrast to other markets. So, there's a lot of value also in simply benchmarking to yourself. Mike, what were you gonna add to that?
Yeah, no, and exactly the point I was just about to make. When you start looking at those benchmarkings, sometimes the data is not readily available. People like us on this conversation can bring it to those conversations, which is great. But many of our listeners here, many folks in the industry are still trying to, where do I find that information? What's important to me? But foundationally, a lot of times it's like, well, what are you working with? What is your own foundation? One of the big areas we think KPIs is all the data coming out of your practice management system. But we're also thinking of your just traditional income statement, your balance sheet, your debt ratios, your profit. How are you doing on a, production per provider basis? How are you doing overall profitability? But you can look at yourself really easily year over year, month to month, last 3-year trend, all of that information that's, if done right, is readily available. So,
yeah. So let's unpack some of this financial benchmarking to start getting into understanding application. And I suppose before we get into that, let's maybe identify some of these key financial benchmarks. You just referenced a few, so maybe you could further explain some of these key areas that you all drill down into.
Yeah, when we think OD, when we think eye care and generally healthcare in general, first I always break it down and say we're all selling time of our life. So I think revenue per hour, but when you get into the healthcare side, you start thinking about revenue per patient. What's the average time that patient is in that visit? How is it working through the process, if you will? How are we doing? Is this the retention side on the customer service? Is this patient coming back for their visits? when they're leaving. So there's patient satisfaction scores, the operational efficiency, how much, once we do the patient visit, are they sticking around to buy their optician lenses from you? And are they working through all of those conversations, if you will? And there's dozens and dozens of KPIs. When we talk about this, the first thing is again, let's start with the foundation. What is easily accessible to you, and what's maybe missing within your practice? Are you saying, hey, I'm not doing enough revenue? So if you're saying, you sit down with you or me, Eric or Tiffany, and say, hey, I'm doing 50,000 a month or 75,000 a month, and I really want to get to 100,000. How do I get there? Well, is it a number of patients? Is it an average revenue per patient? Is it a collections problem, within our payer mix or whatever it may be? How do we increase that, hourly rate or, patient rate, if you will, to get to those numbers?
Yeah, love it, love it. Tiffany, what do you find? I like how Mike was talking about both the kind of this production side of all things, looking at the big goal and kind of IDing if it's a production side of things or more an expense side of things. Tiffany, what do you find if we're to look at financial benchmarking from an operating expense standpoint? What do you find some of the big landmines are out there? I know we all look at financials on a regular basis. So please.
Yeah, so absolutely. So I think, obviously being able to more closely monitor where you're at from both, kind of your historical perspective, as well as looking at peers, is looking at that labor component, right? That's often a big impact. And we've seen over the past few years with the impact of COVID, how, those changes in labor costs have had significant impacts on practices. I think also, looking at those supply costs. So that's often where we can see, if we're doing some good benchmarking, where we can see we might be out of line, we might need to do some type of reevaluation of vendors we're working with, looking at really the choices we're making there to help improve some costs in that area.
Yeah, and you think through that. That's even the stale inventory, right? The inventory turnover to say, is this product really moving? Is it, I've been to several where I love the eye doctor and their inventory for glasses for, a 30-year-old, a 40-year-old, a 50-year-old, they're drastically different. And I'm like, I just can't find what I'm looking for here. And those are the kind of things you have to think about. Who is that market demographic for yourself? But even on those operational, the staff costs you mentioned, Eric, widely different across the nation. It is rising. We know that no matter the market. However, we go to California or Pac West, we go to Louisiana, Texas, it's going to be drastically different conversation relative to those percentages of revenue. But it's important to dial in. And Eric, as well as I do, everybody goes to conferences, they start talking and they hear about a ratio over here that was applicable to a friend that's 30 states away.
Yeah.
And that's their gospel, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I think what we're talking about here is so critically important, because these are fundamentals, right? Kind of some of these shared fundamentals. It all ties back to an informed approach to running your business, being proactive and analyzing your business and understanding what's going on, developing a strategy that empowers all stakeholders, which is, certainly the practice bottom line is important. That's what we're talking about in this discussion, but let's not forget about our other stakeholders, which are going to be our patients and our employees, our team. And then third, having that implementation plan and really taking to it, right? So let's now dig a little deeper and understand maybe some areas and ways that benchmarking impacts the practice regarding, strategic decision-making, certainly impacts across the patient journey and other, operations and workflows.
Well, I think there's a few things when we start, I'm going to start the foundational, right? Because I always talk about, I look at about 20 to 30 new practices a month. Eric, I know you get the opportunity to meet with a lot of new providers and practitioners. And at the end of the day, we always say, all right, great. Let me see the most recent financial statement you have. And sometimes they're 3 to 6 months old. And I'm like, all right, well, let's not jump to KPIs until we really understand what your story is. And I always talk about financial statements, and that is telling your story to another associate, to another partner, to a lender, to a succession plan, anything along those lines. We have to have timely financial statements every single month. We need to understand what's the revenue, what's the profit, is my staffing cost creeping up, is my overtime getting out of whack, is my is the space and facility I have generating enough revenue to make sense in this facility cost that I have? When you start even getting into the technology side, there's been a lot of closets I've been in where there's 3 or 4 pieces of equipment, but it's super efficient. I can just turn my chair around really efficiently to get all those exams. So am I using that space really, really well, within that provider? So I always start with, let's get the foundational right. So many doctors run their practice off their end-of-day report and their checking account balance. And those are great. As a business owner, as a serial entrepreneur, I still look at my checking account every day. You can't break that habit, but let's correlate that back to the foundational fundamentals of accounting. Then
I
we
love
can
it.
start layering in that KPI. And Eric, it actually got me thinking when we were talking KPIs, like, what is your go-to, your absolute favorite KPI, your one you always lean on?
That's a loaded question, but at the end of the day,
Yeah.
it's what is the optometric net? I mean, and now some would say, well, Eric, that's obviously that's a layup, but it starts there because really you're not gonna. That's where you speak of the skeletons in the closet. I mean, understanding that optometric net, and by the way, for our viewers, optometric net is where you're going to look at what you're paying yourself if you own a practice, what you're paying yourself out of the practice, right? Plus all of the other perks you're taking out of that practice as well, right? So depending on how you're set up, and then also applying EBITDA to it, right? Applying back the taxes, the interest, but truly understanding what that true optometric net is, that's really where the picture starts to, that's the big picture.
Yeah.
And then from there, drilling down into the different functional and operational areas. Now, as it were, that's then where we have this step between, well, okay, we have things to drill down in the P&L.
Yeah.
Most notably digging into expenses, COGS. To Tiffany's point, COGS are all over the place. I mean, and look, the fact is, everybody's got something cool for you to have in your practice. But
Yeah.
you don't have, that doesn't mean you have to stock everything. You don't have to inventory everything from every vendor out there. But getting back to it, COGS are a huge hot button right now in eye care as well because of mass consolidation across the supply chain. We're now operating in an arena where a lot of patients, the product and the materials and everything is coming from a third party managed care. And that can wreak havoc on the true COGS and the true expenses that accompany working with those vendors. But as it were, we like to start with optometric net and then work backwards from there to identify where are the leaks in the bucket on the expenses side. It may be COGS, it may be labor, it may be other aspects of operating expenses. But also, we just as much dig into the operational data, right? Because that's where we can now have a full picture of the practice.
Well, and what your style of practice is as well. Like where does that really, what is your focus? And you're right. So many practitioners. So I always think about it from a strategy standpoint, a CFO, Tiffany's background, CFO, mine's the same. When you start thinking about running this practice, I've had so many people buy the next latest equipment at the conference, at the association, but they haven't really incorporated it into their practice, right? Their tax CPA said, hey, I need you to get your tax bill down. So you're going to spend $1 to save 30 cents. And it's like, well, great. But what's that ROI long-term on that piece of equipment? Are we utilizing it? Are we incorporating it? And none of us here are going to talk clinically at all to you, but it's going to be in the conversation. Great. You love this equipment. You're buying in the technology. How do you incorporate it into your patient experience? And I think that becomes that big piece on the equipment. I wanted to touch on that as you mentioned that on that conversation. So I love that.
Absolutely. And the degree to which you tie it back to a broader strategy, right? Because that's I think there's something to be said for, it's one thing to own your job and it's another thing to own a business. And tying back to strategy, perhaps identifying that strategy for the very first time can work wonders, right? So let's now look at this through the lens of different stages of the practice life cycle, right? So respectively, Mike, Tiffany, and your experience in at CPAs and working at the level you do, working with so many practices, let's kind of maybe speak to KPIs and financial benchmarking, perhaps for those that are early in their business. They've just cold started a practice recently. And comparatively compare those to perhaps someone who may have just purchased a practice. So while they are new to ownership, there is that existing cash flow that they're getting into. And then lastly, maybe look at it through the lens of, for those established doctors, particularly those that may be eyeing transition on the horizon, what are some KPIs and financial benchmarks that each of these stages of practice life cycle a doctor should be focusing on?
Go ahead, Tiffany.
Yeah, I was going to say I could start with, maybe the, kind of that beginning stage is really, the benchmarking and the KPIs are really going to be key for you to, I think, establish that strategic vision of where you're wanting to go and be able to start to look at how you're performing against that. So you've got to be able to really be able to look at where are you going and are you starting to work on achieving, those goals. So I think it can help outline that strategic vision for you.
And I think at every stage, Eric, what I always, I'm a big proponent of budgets. I love them. And I think, Eric, the first time we started talking, it was around that conversation to Tiffany's point. We have to know where we're going within this life cycle of a practice. And I always say, start with the end in mind. I'm probably like some of the doctors on this call that are in that early stage where I started a CPA firm when I was 24 years old. And I had no idea, right? I was just trying to figure it out. So I lived off my budget. I lived off that plan and trying to understand. But I always say you got to start with the end in mind. What are you building for? Is it to have the best single practice that you have? You don't want any partners. You don't want any associates. You want an incredible, and it could even be a lifestyle business where you just want an incredible business in your community, serving that patient base and community that you love so much. So truly understand, what am I going to start? How does that practice evolve? If I'm doing a startup, what's the money allowed from the lender, and what am I putting up to get space and TI, tenant improvements, the bank loan coverage? How do I pay myself? What's that first employee I need to hire? And what are those first couple pieces of equipment I need to have to practice the style of healthcare that I want to have for my patients? When you start thinking of, and again, always thinking about the end in mind, well, then you start having that emerging. It's like, okay, I'm a mature practice. Do I want to add, rooms? Do I want to add another location? Do I want to add another provider? What am I thinking about in this transitional period of, there's a lot of opportunities out there to continue to replicate your success or replicate yourself in other markets. And we see a lot of that where it's a provider and they have a couple locations, they have a friend or a family member, and they want to really incorporate them into their practice. So they have this shared vision. It's like, great, we can have a location on each side of town. Let's do it. One may have a little different style inventory because that's the demographics in that community. And one may have a few more technology pieces because that community needs a little bit more of that style testing. And then, of course, you have that transitional phase, Eric, where I'm really starting to think, that question of what do I want to do when I grow up is becoming a little more apparent. As I want to retire, I want to play golf, I want to go fishing, I want to make sure my practice is in good hands. At every one of those stages, what's important is good financials. You talked about the optometric, margin, if you will, profit within that practice. We, in the love language of our world, we call it EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization. But within that EBITDA, you have to pay yourself, to Eric's point. You have to pay your replacement cost. And what's left is that profit left over. And that is ultimately what somebody's trying to acquire from you or trying to buy from you in that stage. So the number one benchmark through every one of those stages is where we are. The budget's going to look a little different, right? On a startup, we're ramping up. We know we're burning cash in those early months. We're trying to figure out what that perfect payer mix, the insurance, how the marketing dollars are used to get the new patients in the door, something along those lines. If we're building a startup, if we got to acquire somebody's practice, then patient retention. Are they coming back as the new owner into my space? Are they feeling welcome enough to say, hey, this was a great handoff. We're going to make sure you're continued to take care of. You don't have to go find a new provider. Just keep coming back to where you were. there's great little nuanced KPIs in each one of those stages that our providers should be thinking about.
Yeah, and I think that what it all shares, though, no matter where one may be in their practice life cycle, it ties back to the bigger picture and quantifying the bigger picture, the budget, right?
Yeah,
Which is,
the
and
budget.
as you know, Mike, Tiffany, and as you kind of, I suppose, referenced here when unpacking that, we work with a lot of doctors that are coming into practice ownership. They're cold starting the practice. They're purchasing that established business. So understanding all of those mechanics of those financials, and whether they are established financials of the business that is being purchased, or these are financials we are creating, a master budget that's being created for the very beginning of a cold start. It's a matter of quantifying. We like to say quantify the vision, right? Because we have a ton of fun connecting with doctors, hearing about what the clinical vision is, the service to the community, the service to their patients.
Yeah.
So now we're on this journey, this mission of, okay, now let's quantify that vision. And then we're ready to go, right? Then we're ready to go get them with the bank. Then we're ready to go look at properties and on down the line to implement this business, to launch.
And I'll tell you, so on the budget conversation, so many people get overwhelmed by the conversation. I certainly know my wife does when I bring it up, but in general, with an entrepreneur as well, it's like, how do I start? Right? I don't know my revenue per patient yet. I don't know how many patients I'm going to get to see. So I always say start with the knowns, right? Start with, your rent is going to be X, and you have 3 to 4 months of free rent, depending on how you were able to negotiate your space. You're going to hire 2 people out of the gate. You know that you need at least this much for the loan payment. Those things, then you can back into, great. In order to get to this much, I need to generate this much revenue. All right. Average revenue is X. How many patients can I see in that? Or how many days a week am I going to be open? I need to generate X number of dollars per day in revenue. So make it as simple as possible, but make it to where every one of those measurables or key performance indicators you can put your hands on easily. If you're having to sit down and calculate and recreate and all this stuff, we find time and time again, people will not, do it. They will not measure it up. We lost Tiffany in the headline. There you go. Again, speaking of technology, the auto lights, but working through that. But yeah, those are the things I always think about is how do I start on my budget? Like, just start with the expenses and we can build into it.
Yeah. Love it. Fantastic. Y'all, what a jam-packed conversation. I mean, this is and this is absolutely still just the tip of the iceberg. And to that end, really excited to have you all join us. CLA is going to be joining us at Business Builder, Pathways to Success for Modern ECPs, coming up in March 14th, 2024 in New York City. Get all the details at Akrinos. So Mike, can't wait to have you there. Well, we're gonna continue this conversation in a live in-person format, and so everybody will be able to bring their questions and further hash this out, how to leverage these KPIs and financial benchmarks for that next practice milestone. But y'all, before we sign off, we'd love for you all to share a little bit more about the work you all do at CLA, the solutions that you all provide, impact on the practice, and then how folks can get in touch with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So CLA is a really large, small CPA firm, as we like to say it. So we are the 8th largest CPA firm in the nation. So we are in every market. So we can serve you locally and all the good stuff. But we serve Main Street America. We love small business owners. That is who we serve. We don't do publicly traded work. We don't do SEC. We serve thousands and thousands of doctors all over the nation in accounting and bookkeeping and strategy and tax planning and all the likes. Really try to get to the widget of their business and their practice to say, okay, here's the traditional P&L balance sheet, but let's correlate that with the reporting Akrinos has and look at some of the dashboards and look at some of the KPIs and help tell that story. As we go in, Eric, to New York City, I know one of the things you and I thought about, and hopefully for this audience, is doing live case studies or having live conversations where people can bring their financials and sit down with us and have those conversations and say, hey, what do you see? Is there something that's just glaring to you within that process? So for those who are going to get to join us, I'd love and challenge you to do just that. We'd love to have that conversation and go from there.
Yeah. Mike, Tiffany, incredible opportunities right now in independent eye care, independent optometry, and the work you guys are doing, providing the financial advisory and resources and accountancy and consultancy is just top notch, and really honored to have CLA be a part of the inaugural Business Builder. So, hey, for our viewers out there, we hope you found this valuable. If you do want to continue the conversation with Mike and Tiffany, you can learn more about CLA. Head on over to claconnect.com. You can also find Mike there in LinkedIn land.
Crazy LinkedIn name there.
Crazy LinkedIn. Yeah,
There's
right.
a couple Mike Whites in the world, apparently.
Fantastic. Well, on behalf of all of us here at Akrinos, thank you all for joining us on this episode of Access. If you're looking for more great practice management tips and business insights like this, head on over to Akrinos.com, subscribe to the Akrinos YouTube channel, and follow us on the socials. Well, Mike White, Tiffany Harrison, thank you all so much for joining us on this episode of Access.
Absolutely. Have a great day.